The Chesapeake Bay is in crisis. Pollution from factories and urban development flood rivers and streams. City and suburban dwellers, along with fishermen, pollute and overfish, while farmers allow harmful runoff from erosion and manure to contaminate the bay. Local and federal environmental agencies battle to educate and pass laws that force city dwellers, farmers, and fishermen to stop their destructive practices and help save what's left of the bay. For decades, environmentalists have targeted crab fishermen in hopes of changing their behavior. But their efforts were met with fierce resistance, and like their fathers and grandfathers before them, islanders are known for their independent nature. Opponents underestimated the resolve this small group of fishermen had in maintaining their culture and livelihood. Eventually, tensions between fishermen and environmentalists turned hostile.
We had a fire in one of our buildings on Smith Island, and it was ruled arson by the fire marshal.
It had been said on the CB radio that they wanted to put an ice pick through my neck.
Thing of it is the watermen are at the bottom of the cycle. So we're the one who suffers the most. But we're the one that gets regulated the most.
The watermen fought bitterly against regulations they felt were unnecessary. All that would change the day an unlikely outsider arrived on Tangier Island. Far more than any Mariners Museum or Mystic Seaport or Williamsburg, places like the islands are art, made all the more artful for contriving nothing, for simply being. Tangier Island lies about an hour from the Virginia mainland in the waters near the southern tip of the Chesapeake Bay. Tangier is accessible only by boat, and its 600 inhabitants are descendants of immigrants from Cornwall, the west country of Great Britain. Like their fathers and grandfathers before them, these people live off the bounty of the bay, the crabs, oysters, and eels. And they call themselves watermen.
I started when I was 17 with my father. That's 21 years. Well, it's just nice being out in the air, and you do have the freedom to decide what you can do aboard your boat, how to fish your pots.
I've got two boys, one which is 19 and one which is 13. And there's nothing that I would love any more than to see them have a future on the water.
There's really no other way to generate income unless you're a storekeeper, or unless you operate a gift shop, or you happen to be lucky enough to be one of the tour boat operators. It's truly the crabs, the oysters, the fish that are the engine, the economic engine for those islands.
Tangier is famous for its soft-shelled crabs. Watermen cast wire mesh crab pots, which are later pulled back on board. In the winter, they dredge the ocean floor with a large net. At other times, they drag the floor with a smaller net known as a crab scrape.
It catches everything it catches, and we just pick out the good crabs. We may catch anywhere from 50 crabs to 350.
I'm usually harvesting the pillar crabs, and which I shed out to my crab house. I shed them for the soft shell crabs.
This is a pillar crab. We call him a rain crab because of the red rim around the fin. That means in a few days he'll be a soft shell crab.
Smith Islander told me once, the thing we do best out here is share the bay's fate. And what he meant was they, more than any other people in America, are living offshore, harvesting nature's bounty, are really linked into it. They share the bay's fate.
John Crockett, his 8 sons and their families were Tangier Island's first known settlers. A third of the islanders still bear the Crockett name, and most consider themselves kinfolk. Crockett's legacy is evident in the tightly clustered backyards where tombstones bear only a handful of last names. The island has few cars, as residents usually weave their way through narrow streets on bicycles and golf carts. It has just 2 grocery stores, which are supplied by a 65-foot boat from Crisfield, Maryland, that brings food, mail, passengers, and the occasional movie rental. There is just 1 police officer, but no jail, as crime is almost non-existent. As a result, parents let their children roam the island, knowing that someone is always near. Islanders are so isolated that many mainland residents don't even know they exist. And 250 miles to the north, water flows from Pennsylvania farmland into the fragile Chesapeake Bay.
Right in our road, huh?
There isn't anything any more beautiful than what it is you're seeing here today. I love the soil. I love to be involved with nature and the connection between nature and God and the big beautiful skies that we're looking at. All that kind of works together. So it's complex, but it's deep. It's in my heart, and I intend to do it until I can't do it anymore.
What do you like best about being on the farm?
Feeding and take care of the animals. And delivering calves.
Is that scary?
No! Except whenever they come back upside down or backwards.
I'd like to get up at about 4 o'clock in the morning and come out the door and look up and see clear, frosty morning and the stars are shining and breathe that cool, crisp fall air in deep. The Amish have a saying that your farm is just on loan to you from your children. I want the next generation, whether it's my kids or whoever, to have something here to work with, and I could see it going. And a couple places it was down to the slate, and once the topsoil's going, that's it, you know.
My dad was born in this house. I was born in this house. And when I'm going, I want my son to have this, and I hopefully that there's something left for them grandchildren.
While their lifestyle may seem simple to outsiders, islanders fiercely protect it. Yet they have long been criticized for damaging the very ecosystem they rely on for their survival. Since John Smith first saw Chesapeake Bay 400 years ago, 75% of its natural resources, clean water, soil, and wildlife, have been destroyed. Scientists claim that pollution, over-harvesting, and runoff destroy seagrass beds, causing crab populations to plummet. According to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, commercial harvests once yielded nearly 100 million pounds of blue crab each year. But during the last 10 years, harvests have dropped by more than 40%.
In terms of habitat, we've lost about half of the bay's filters. Fisheries, we have some real weaknesses like oysters at 1% of what they were.
The watershed of the Chesapeake Bay is about 66,000 square miles, and the bay is a fairly small area of water, so it's actually the largest land-to-water ratio of any estuary in the world, which creates the problem, really, because you're drawing the pollutants from such a large area and concentrating them in such a small body of water.
There's a lot of farm runoff. There's a lot of unnecessary lawn fertilizer. There's a lot of pollution from cars. There's a lot of pollution from factories, and there's a lot of pollution from watermen themselves.
Over 90% of the people on the island are related either to the fishery or are in the fishery, that if the fishery goes, Tangier goes.
At the northern end of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, farmers share the waterman's dependence on nature's bounty. But environmentalists are alarmed. Erosion sweeps valuable topsoil along with manure and pesticides into creeks and rivers, poisoning the food chain. This runoff pours into the Chesapeake Bay, devastating the fish, crab, and oyster populations and the people whose livelihoods depend on it. Matt Earhart was a farmer before he joined the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's Pennsylvania Bureau as executive director.
Pennsylvania's primary problem from an agricultural standpoint is that we produce a lot of manure from all the livestock, all the dairy, beef, poultry operations in the watershed.
Hey girl. How you doing, old girl?
The manure is produced in a fairly localized area, and it's just more nutrients than that geographic area can absorb and use for crop production and forestry and the growth of plants. So when we have rainfall events, it runs off into the Chesapeake Bay.
And I realized very quickly that I was taking my profit and was moving it from here to there, and at the next thunderstorm was probably moving it from there down in the hollow, down to my spring, down to the spring run, down to the creek, down to the river, and ultimately into the ocean. It's nothing to lose 9 tons of soil to wind erosion during a year.
Topsoil depletion caused the demise of many great civilizations. According to author John Robbins, 75% of the original topsoil in the United States is already gone. This year alone, 4 million acres of cropland, about the size of Connecticut, will be lost to erosion.
I think what's happened is overuse of chemicals. In other words, a little bit doesn't work, so we use a little more. And then we use a little more. And the next thing we know, we've saturated what the soil is able to bind onto and hold. So then it's going to go someplace else. It can't stay there. It's got to move on. And so somebody else has it now.
The Maryland legislature passed regulations to force farmers to have nutrient management plans. Unfortunately, going from a voluntary to a regulatory framework did not make the farmers perform any better.
One of the things that they've hollered farmers, 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 and none of us farmers up here are convinced that we're the guys who are actually polluting the bay. I mean, we feel it's more your golf courses, your lawns, your developments in the bigger cities. To always hanging on the farmer kind of has got us with a bad taste in our mouth, if you know what I'm saying. It would take time and effort, I feel, to gain the farmers' trust to where they would change if they had practices that needed to change.
It's getting harder on the small farmer, you know. The big corporations are taking over farms. So the small guy's going to plow every inch of ground he has.
Many farmers retaliated by only following the minimum land use requirements.
So this notion that we can solve environmental problems strictly through a regulatory framework, I think, is simply wrong.
I think the real problem has been that too many folks in the environmental community really have no ties to agriculture. Too much of the general population doesn't know where their food comes from. They think it comes from a grocery store. And that creates a cultural and a language barrier, which has really hindered working with agriculture from the environmental community standpoint.
Around 1967, people concerned about the deterioration of the bay formed the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. The CBF's purpose: save the bay through environmental education. In 1995, CBF called for a ban on all crabbing beyond the depth of 40 feet. Most islanders disagreed with the proposal. Was this an attempt by CBF to attack their very livelihood? This notion quickly ignited a cultural and political firestorm.
Tangier watermen do not have much respect for environmentalists. They see environmentalists and scientists as the enemy.
I think some of the environmental groups themselves would like to see the watermen off the bay altogether. They see the watermen as a threat that they're just out there to take and take and take.
I'm afraid some watermen think we're out to put them out of business, and nothing could be further from the truth.
And the scientists, of course, have an income whether the rain falls or not. So they can afford to be concerned about the long-term condition of the bay. The watermen can't.
One of the difficulties that the Chesapeake Bay Foundation has had in communicating with watermen is that we use the language of science, and science talks about generalities, probabilities, lots of numbers, and it's very different from the hands-on, I was here last week and I know this part of the bay like the back of my hand experience that watermen have.
My husband despised CBF. I mean, he had a circle with a slash through it and CBF paint on his crab house. He hated it.
As the debate raged, mounting regulations, including limits on new commercial fishing licenses, put economic pressure on the watermen, whose very survival may hinge on whether the next generation has confidence in the future.
My youngest son doesn't have any hope at all in being a waterman and carrying on the heritage here on Tangier. I mean, we're to the end of the road. We can't fall back anymore and make a living. We just can't survive.
If I have to quit making a living on the water, and there's only so much you can do. I'm 47 years old, and I got to go find a new livelihood. Got to go to college. I don't think so. I think I'm going to be a waterman until the day I die.
CBF may have added fuel to the fire when they failed to consult with enough watermen before proposing to shorten the crabbing season.
You put that out there with a little bit of twisted truth and untruth and half-truth, and pretty soon it got to be a pretty ugly scene.
A fire broke out in one of CBF's buildings on Smith Island. The fire marshal said it was arson, but nobody was charged and the case was never resolved.
The fire became a visible expression of the heat of the conflict. So we don't know who did it.
For centuries, these independent and hard-working watermen have had a history of violence. Throughout much of the 1800s, watermen commonly launched pirate raids on each other's oyster beds. People were shot over crabs and oysters. There were ongoing battles between Tangier and Smith Islands, fights among watermen, fights between Maryland and Virginia. In the early 1800s, Methodist minister Joshua Thomas preached his way across Chesapeake Bay, hoping to convert islanders and stop their notorious lawlessness. In spite of his missionary successes, it's doubtful Thomas could imagine it would take nearly 200 years for the spiritual seed he planted to fully bear its fruit.
The biblical perspective from my part was brother against brother, sister against sister, friend against friend, church against community. I thought we need to heal that.
It's something that the Lord put on my heart years and years ago, and I've prayed about it, that the Lord would send someone here to teach us, exactly where He wants us.
That someone was an unknown outsider, a doctoral candidate from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who stepped off the boat and right into the bay's raging firestorm. Susan Drake Emmerich, who worked on environmental treaties for the U.S. State Department in Washington, D.C., came to Tangier after hearing about the shed burning and the spiritual revival that had swept the island in 1995. Emmerich believed that it might prove an ideal testing ground for her thesis that conflict in faith-based communities requires faith-based resolutions. Since the 1850s, Tangier Island has remained a Christian community. Emmerich's own convictions enabled her to explore the connections between her Christian faith and her academic research.
So since I decided to work on my PhD, I really wanted to do a very practical piece of work that hopefully would make a lasting impression on the world about the importance of the role of faith in people's lives and how it motivates them to do good and to do the right thing.
People around here are very slow to change. And a lot of people don't take calmly to strangers, to outside people coming in.
Hi, Mrs. Crockett. How are you?
I went to several members of the church and I saw that the church was the major force for change and that women were also a major force for change in the community.
This is a part of our way of life, just like crabbing is, God is. I mean, you can't separate the two.
When I look upon His face, the one who saved me.
So many books and documentaries are done on watermen. It's a woman behind every one of them watermen. And this co-op gives it a chance to see all the women and how they work and how they help their husbands in the crab business. And, we depend on the bay for our living just like our husbands depends on the bay for their crabs.
And so if you come in, make no reference to the church, no reference to the scriptures, it is like telling only half of the story that has to be told in order to generate the needed change, the needed action.
When the faith-based effort was first proposed, I was both interested but also had a certain level of skepticism about its ability to be able to truly change the behavior of the people on Tangier. I've been working with Tangier for 15 years. I've been trying to instill an environmental ethic there, and I know how difficult that is. And to think that some effort can come in and a very short wave of the wand make a difference, I frankly was very skeptical.
Emmerich would try something that CBF did not. She used a combination of ethnography, a study of a people's culture, and action research, a method that requires her to be a facilitator. Emmerich encouraged local leadership by living on the island and experiencing crabbing firsthand. Even as an outsider, Emmerich's faith-based approach impressed islanders enough that they invited her to speak at a joint public service of Whme Memorial United Methodist Church and New Testament Church. Emmerich spoke to islanders out of their shared faith, showing how biblical principles of earth-keeping and personal integrity must lead to a lifestyle of environmental awareness. God blessed them, saying, "Prosper, reproduce, fill the earth, take charge. Be responsible for fish in the sea and birds in the air, for every living thing that moves on the face of the earth."
When I was giving this message, I used this picture, which is found in every waterman's boat practically on the island. On the one hand, the waterman's praying, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," and the next minute throwing bottles and cans and whatever overboard. I think that many of the watermen actually understood and saw for the first time the linkage of their faith to their livelihood and their everyday life out on the water.
She had the Bible to back up all of her foundations and everything that she was trying to accomplish and prove.
Emmerich's teaching so affected the watermen that they made a covenant or promise with God to change their behavior. What they promised was to live out the principles of earth-keeping and integrity by protecting the environment and obeying fishery laws.
The covenant was a group of men, 60-some men, stood up in church one morning and vowed before God, that they would obey His laws. So many people have made so much fun of the covenant, and it was a statement that said, hey, you've got a bunch of Christians here who some of them weren't obeying the law, who are going to commit to obeying the law no matter what, no matter if it affects the pocketbook, no matter if it affects anything else. We're going to stand up and we're going to make a stand. I thought it was the prettiest thing when they stood up Sunday morning and we handed out about a 2-foot piece of red ribbon signifying Christ's blood to me. And they wrapped that around their antennas, put it on a door, something of their boat. It didn't say, hey, I'm a better man than you, I'm a Christian. It said, hey, Christian man in that bottom of that boat, you're not working for man, you're working for God.
The covenant covered not only working on the water, but you shouldn't break any laws. You should pay what taxes you're supposed to pay, boating laws, speed limits.
She's opened a lot of the watermen's eyes to the fact that, hey, we need to stop throwing our trash in the water. We need to keep our oil cans on the boat.
Niner saved his for a whole week. It was to talk at the island. How many bags of trash Niner had on the dock that he would normally have dumped into Chesapeake Bay.
I never seen any harm of throwing trash overboard until it was revealed to me that I was damaging my witness for Christ. The first few weeks of doing it, it was a pretty big hassle.
Change I've seen in my husband is enormous. It's nothing short of a miracle.
And I remember cars, junk cars in the streams, clutter everywhere, just not a very visually appealing place.
I've had people who come here occasionally tell me that the island is so much cleaner now. It looks like a different place.
I do the best of my ability to abide by the laws, such as no saving any little crabs or no saving any illegal soft crabs.
Many of the watermen lost a lot of money when they began following fishing regulations, and those who continued to overfish and break the law prospered for a time. But less than a year later, something unusual happened.
There was a pill run that started in end of July, and it's just finished the 1st of October, and it's unheard of to go that long this late into the season. You know, I made less money this spring, but God made up for it, more than made up for it, by what He provided toward the end of the season.
CBF was surprised by the watermen's transformation and the speed by which these changes were made. Don Baugh, who had worked with Tangier men for 15 years trying to instill ethical and useful environmental practices, finally realized that CBF would never be successful until they acknowledged the islanders' Christian worldview.
And so once we were able to make that bridge and to see that this Christian-based community valued things in a Christian way, and that if we could get them to embrace the environment within the Christian value system, then in fact we were going to move forward.
With the covenant as their catalyst, islanders created a stewardship initiative, the Tangier Waterman Stewardship for the Chesapeake, TASK. Their 2020 vision plan encourages environmental and economic stewardship on the island and throughout the bay. TASK gives the people of Tangier Island a voice in regulatory matters. Out of this stewardship initiative grew an advocacy group, Faith, families actively involved in improving Tangier's heritage. Its focus is to enhance and sustain local fisheries, provide better family health coverage, develop a more diversified job market, and address commercial licensing and legislative issues. In addition, CBF is working to assist the island economically.
We've asked other partners to come in to look at relocating businesses there.
We would like to get the women together to do more crafts because we have a lot of tourists coming into the island. We've got 3 boats come in every day in summertime between May and October.
What Susan brought, what this whole idea was able to accomplish was to resolve a conflict in a nonviolent way.
My role is simply, and has only really been, as a catalyst, as a spark, but all the ideas that have come up, whether it be the covenant, whether it be the 2020 vision, all have been derived from Tangiermen.
Emmerich believes the lessons learned from applying faith-based stewardship to faith-centered and resource-dependent communities also applies to foresters and fishermen in the Northwest, farmers in the Midwest, and even urban dwellers, no matter what the basic belief system is. News about the Waterman's Covenant spread rapidly around the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Pennsylvania farmers, with the help of Susan Emmerich and local conservationist Cara Ball, invited a small group of watermen up north to share their story and their common faith. The watermen shared their stories and their lives. They brought bushels of crabs from the bay for a feast with their brothers in Pennsylvania.
Scraping it out, it's getting it.
crabs. What a
I was leery at the beginning. I really was, because I didn't know who was pushing this thing. But once I talked to them and I realized they were concerned for God and doing what He wanted them to do, then I felt they were sincere, but I was not sure who was pushing the buttons behind, so to speak.
We thank You that You have found us faithful and entrusted to us a part of Your creation.
Community members assembled at Bethel Church in the Sidling Hill Creek area and listened to biblically based reasons for caring for the environment. They also learned more about the watermen, their neighbors downstream.
We're dealing with the same stuff that you all, people who don't understand our fishery.
A lot of us probably weren't paying nearly enough attention to the idea of throwing things overboard. The idea that once you throw it away, there's a lot of water out there and it's gone forever, but it's really not gone forever.
I thank the Lord for what taking the covenant meant to me. It put a mark in the sand that, I told God that I wouldn't go beyond this loan. And the loan's real simple. It's God's Word.
The covenant that the watermen took is a promise that you just do not step back from. And that level of commitment is rare in our society today.
It is key that the farmers understand the impact that they're having on the watermen's livelihood and culture on the Chesapeake Bay.
Cara Ball lived and worked with farmers to help educate them about environmental issues and the bay.
And we came to an understanding that the actions that we do up here are affecting our neighbors downstream, and they were part of our community too. They were related by a physical aspect, which ended up in their crab pots and ended up in their backyard and affected the way that they would make a living.
And it's also important to bring the watermen up here so that they understand the difficulties that the farmers face in fixing the problem.
Runoff from erosion on farms creates silt in waterways. This silt travels downstream and accumulates in the bay, blocking sunlight from reaching underwater grasses. The young crabs and fish need these grasses to survive and reach adulthood. Back in Bedford County, Pennsylvania, farms can be the last barrier before water enters these creeks. Scientists call the last barrier, or filter between runoff and the stream, a buffer, usually a strip of trees, wetlands, or brush that filter out pesticides, manure, oils, and sediment.
Water now has to flow through the wetland before it goes into Flintstone Creek. At this point in time, whenever we get a heavy rain, even though we've got a culvert up there that empties into this thing, there is no discolored water that runs into Flintstone Creek at this point because the wetland has been here and has been restored.
On Pennsylvania's hilly landscape, contour farming is another way to stop valuable topsoil from washing away.
If you have one strip in corn, another strip in grass, another strip in corn, you'll control that erosion. If it does wash a little bit in that cornfield, when that water gets out in that sod strip, why, it'll hold it.
It's a long-term usage or abuse of chemicals that gets us in trouble. Our water, just as our land and just as our bodies, if it's not taken care of, it will come back and make you pay a price. These are some of our cucumber plants here that can be a challenge to grow organically. If I spray a harsh chemical on this plant, guess what's going to get it when they come to pollinate? And I think there goes a honeybee, see him? And remember, whatever the bee takes off that plant goes into its honey. That chemical will be in the honey.
Farmers have used pesticides and other chemicals for decades. On the Red Miles farm, doctors believe David's recent physical problems stem from contact with pesticides.
He can't feel his hands and a lot of different parts of his legs. He has severe nerve damage throughout his body. right now experiencing seizures at least 3 a week, and they have not found a cause, but they think that this could be a reason, is all these chemicals and that he was spraying in his younger years. And when I was 16, they diagnosed me with multiple sclerosis, and they found out that I had no way of getting it through heredity. So they were looking at environmental aspects and everything. So it's still up in the air what environmental effect it could have been, but it could have been somebody overspraying their field. Nobody really has an answer.
What happens to the next generation? What happens to them?
Pesticides flow into the Chesapeake Bay from farms and get absorbed by the crabs and consumed by residents of the bay's watershed. Cancer rates are higher on the eastern shore and in waterman communities. According to the American Cancer Society, 4.1% of Tangier's residents have cancer, compared to only 1.3% of the overall U.S. population.
When the watermen were here 2 years ago, they shared their hearts, their livelihood, and their commitment to the Lord. It stirred probably 10 folks in the congregation enough to take time out of their schedule to go and see for themselves what it meant to live on Tangier Island and to serve God there.
Out and they watched the actual crabbing operations, and that was real interesting to them. A lot of questions there. We took them out and pulled up crab pots and just showed them what life around here was like on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you.
After the farmers realized what a direct connection they had with the bay and with us and with our survival, they got real excited about what they might be able to do to help us.
Eventually, 11 farmers and landowners entered into a stewardship covenant, similar to the Watermans.
So I will take this covenant. Would any of the rest of you like to take this covenant with me? God bless you. Thank you. God bless you. Would anyone else like to sign one?
The reason why I took the covenant was because of our trip to Tangier. It enlightened us on their culture, the language, what they do for a living, and how everything up here affects what they do down there.
Farmers and landowners created a list of responsibilities that became a message of love and support from Bethel Christian Church to their brothers and sisters downstream. It included keeping cows out of the creek, planting forested buffers, not dumping used oil on the ground, keeping informed about issues affecting the Chesapeake Bay, and praying for the watermen. On Tangier Island, effects of the faith-based stewardship initiative began to ease the battle between watermen and environmentalists. However, because of the covenant's emphasis on obedience to civil and fishery laws, a few of the watermen argued that a willing reduction in the harvest would destroy the local economy. They contend that harvest levels are simply cyclical and will rebound on their own without the initiative.
There is some fierce resistance to the stewardship initiative. I think some people on Tangier are very upset about it.
It had been said on the CB radio that they wanted to put an ice pick through my neck.
This small group not only threatened Emmerich's life, they ostracized those involved in the covenant, faith, and task, some of whom have felt pressured to abandon their pledge.
I've been called a lot of different stuff, and that I've been brainwashed, that I don't understand what's going on. I've had a lot of backs turned on me. I've lost my closest friend. We talk and we speak to each other, but it's not like it was. It'll probably never be like it was.
The commitment that we make to our Lord is not something we turn on Sunday morning for an hour. It's 24/7.
It's my personal opinion that as Christians, we should be at the forefront of the environmental movement. And I think that we have better reasons and better motivation than perhaps most people do to truly take care of the earth as God has given it to us.
We all did what happened to the bay, and it's going to take all of us to fix it.
I think the whole experience has kind of refined us. We needed to sort of weed out some of this stuff in our lives that weren't so important and focus more on the things that are important.
A lot of the feeling of total helplessness has gone, and a lot more confidence that there is a future and that their children and grandchildren very well may be able to stay here.
I've learned that it takes more than talking love. I mean, you have to show it regardless how people treat you.
Now look here.
Watermen and farmers were not the only people who changed. Environmentalists realized they had contributed to the conflict on Tangier Island by not considering the importance of faith.
I think it is critical that we as environmentalists remember when we're working in communities and with other groups of people that we are mindful and respectful of their beliefs and their culture, whatever it may be, whether Judeo-Christian, whether it's Muslim, that we're not in a vacuum espousing our views.
What began as a doctoral dissertation is now becoming an accepted approach to engaging culture and improving the environment. In many ways, we're all like the Chesapeake Bay Islanders. We struggle with the ebb and flow of our demands for natural resources. But what if, unlike the watermen and their families, we become so far removed from the natural resources we become oblivious to the destructive power of overconsumption and waste? Behaviors the watermen know all too well. Behaviors that nearly killed their way of life. Back in the misty Chesapeake, islanders continue to tie their fate to the sometimes precarious life cycle of the bay's valued blue crab. As they battle the forces that threaten their legacy, islanders now carry a renewed and deepened resolve to keep their covenant and serve as a vital link between the spiritual and physical, between heaven and earth.